This is the part where we wait for people to jump on, and so it's slightly awkward. Hello from the past if you're watching this in the future and not live. Hello, Erin. Erin is always the first one on. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our literary cocktail hour. I'm Catherine. I'm the social media manager. Hi! Hello, New Hampshire. I'm the social media manager here at Trident, and by that I mean here at my house for Trident. Every Friday at 5 o'clock, I am here on Instagram Live talking about literature, giving recommendations, answering any questions you might have. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat and I will answer them as they come up. So the way this works is I have made myself a drink. I will show you what I am drinking. I hope you are all drinking at home. And then I will talk about books and answer questions. Hello, Long Island, New York. So today, I don't know if you guys saw this news. I'm assuming you did if you're plugged into the book world like me. Stephenie Meyer is coming out with a new Twilight book. So, Midnight Sun, the long-awaited version of Twilight from Edward's point of view, is coming out on August 4th. You can pre-order it now on our website. And because of that, we are going to be talking about vampires today, which is one of my personal favorite topics. I'm very excited. We're going to go through the literary history of vampires. Like I said, if you have any questions, vampire-related or other, please feel free to jump on and say them. Today, I am not going to show you how to make the drink because what I made was sangria. I guess, technically speaking, I could have made a Bloody Mary, but the thing is, I have to drink this, and I wasn't going to drink that. So I've got a nice chalice to drink sangria from. Cheers. It's very good. This sangria has red wine, it has triple sec, it has orange juice, pomegranate juice, simple syrup, and then I put in oranges and apples and blackberries. So, very easy. You can see all of the ingredients on our Instagram on both our story and the picture, so feel free to take a look. I guess we should start with the vampires. So, I have some notes that I will be referencing because I wanted to do more of a history with this one than just my opinion on books. So, vampires have been a part of culture for a long time. There are a lot of folklore about vampires. There is a lot of folklore about vampires. In Transylvania, there was like a myth that, it might not have been Transylvania, it might have been Hungary. There was a myth that like when a vampire washed, it would rain. So when there was times without rain, they would like make everybody go and wash because the assumption was one of them was a vampire. There's a lot of stuff like that. However, the first real vampire story that we talk about was written in 1819 by Polidori, and that is The Vampire. So we've got a copy of that here to start off with. Polidori was Lord Byron's doctor. He wrote The Vampire at the same party that Frankenstein was written. Obviously, Frankenstein was the better story, but we all knew that already. It was originally published anonymously, and people assumed it was published by Lord Byron, which was not true. Polidori had written it, and the count in it, the vampire, is based on Lord Byron, because Polidori was super in love with him. It's the first book to kind of fuse vampire with like the idea of like a narrative and romance and that sort of like upper class aristocratic thing that you get nowadays, rather than just like folklore of a creature that drinks blood. So, great to start off with. Next, we're going to move to 1872 in a book predating Dracula. This is Carmilla. Carmilla is written by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly. He's an Irish author. This book predates Dracula by 26 years. It was first serialized as it came out, so that's always fun because I think old books that are serialized are more fun because they had to keep you interested the whole time, or like next week you wouldn't read it. So it's like easier to read. I don't know. It was first serialized. This is a lesbian vampire story. If any of you are familiar with the web series Carmilla, it is based on this book. So what it is a female vampire, Carmilla, ends up like seducing this young woman and preying on her, etc., etc. Vampires have often been used to talk about like the things we fear in society. So in 1872, and other years, one of the things they feared in society was homosexuality and sexuality in general, let's be honest with ourselves. So that like comes up and it's seen as like predatory and bad. However, the web series Carmilla kind of subverts that and makes it like a fun thing. There's also a book based on the web series, which is based on this book, so it gets a little complicated later on. It's, like I said, definitely worth reading. A big thing about like the history of vampires. And now we're moving on, and in my notes it says we are entering the Dracula zone, which I'm very excited about. Dracula is one of my favorite books of all time. I'm very excited by it. So, of course, the next book is Dracula by Bram Stoker. Dracula is the quintessential vampire book, but Dracula was not considered like an instant classic. This book didn't come out and people were like, oh my god, how could this be? This person wrote the best book ever, which like would my reaction would have been. I don't know what they were doing. So Dracula spawned the way vampires are seen today. Most of the things that vampires are today are either based on Dracula or like based on subverting Dracula. Do you have a favorite Dracula movie? I do, and I will be getting there. Erin asks, have you watched the new Dracula show? I haven't yet, and I don't know if it'll be good. I have not watched the new Dracula show because I don't trust Stephen Moffat. And also because I hear the ending is very bad, and there are other Draculas that I can watch. So, it wasn't an immediate hit. The movies that came out based on Dracula are actually what made it so popular. Speaking of, my personal favorite Dracula movie is the classic Bela Lugosi Dracula, which is very good. It's in black and white. It came out, I believe, in the 1930s. It's a lot of fun. It really gets to the heart of Dracula, although, to be honest, it leaves out the cowboy, which is just like a mystery that appears in Dracula. There was a time when, like, Ireland and England were really into cowboys, and so occasionally they would just appear in literature, which does happen in Dracula. Bela Lugosi's Dracula was actually originally done without music, and then it was scored later, which is a lot of fun, and the score really makes the movie, so make sure you watch that version. Even though it wasn't originally a big hit, it was like popular with a lot of really big people, such as Arthur Conan Doyle, who, although he hated his own works, Arthur Conan Doyle hating Sherlock Holmes and trying to kill him off, Arthur Conan Doyle loved Dracula and called it like the perfect book. Also, one of the other things, speaking of earlier we were talking about vampires in like queer literature, Dracula is very heavily influenced by Oscar Wilde's Trial and by the fact that Bram Stoker was very queer himself. He was basically in love with both Henry Irving and Walt Whitman, wrote a bunch of love letters to Walt Whitman. He married Oscar Wilde's ex-wife, or ex-girlfriend, I guess, and it was like basically just to make her the executive of his estate. Dracula himself is based on Henry Irving, which is kind of cool, although Henry Irving was apparently a bit of a jerk, even though Bram Stoker was in love with him. But sometimes it's like that. Now, moving on to the second version of Dracula I have here today. This is The Powers of Darkness, also by Bram Stoker. I was so excited when I learned about this. This is the Icelandic translation of Dracula. For those of you who don't know and aren't plugged into the Dracula mainframe the way I am, the Icelandic version was discovered a few years ago, I believe in 2017, that it had originally been translated into Icelandic, and the Icelandic story was incredibly different, and then it got translated back. So, how did this happen? Why is this version of Dracula so different? Did they just write another book? The answer is no. The answer is, The way translations used to work is you could, like, you personally sold the rights in different countries instead of, like, nowadays usually your publisher sells the rights in different countries. And they're all interconnected. So if you were translating, the Dracula Mainframe would be a good band name. You are correct. If you were translating something, you reached out to a translator and told them the story that you wanted to be told. So, why did Bram Stoker want this different story told? Also, how is it different? This version of Dracula has a lot more that is in Transylvania. They spend way more time in the castle. It also kind of sets it up as, like, a true story about a vampire, which is really cool. And it was also originally serialized, so towards the end it kind of, like, loses its thread, because in order to get through it, people kind of lost interest, and they were like, well, we're just gonna summarize the rest of it. So the first 2/3 are, like, super wonderful and definitely worth reading. The last third is kind of a summary of most of what happens in real Dracula. But Bram Stoker originally wanted Dracula to be a true story, kind of like a Blair Witch-style project book. However, he was like, there's a killer haunting the streets of London. And then his publishers were like, listen, Abraham, great book, love this. However, there is actually a killer haunting the streets of London. He's Jack the Ripper. You might have heard of him. We can't say that he's a vampire. That will cause so much panic. And so they were like, we're not going to do that sort of narrative. We're not doing that. So when he had the chance to publish it in Icelandic, he did do that sort of narrative, which is a lot of fun. This particular translation is not great to read instead of Dracula, but if, like me, you're a big fan of Dracula, great to read alongside it. It also, for people who like the history and like more literary academic aspects, it has a lot of footnotes that goes through it, and it has, like, 2 really big essays in the beginning talking about, like, it maps out Dracula's house based on all of the interactions. It does all sorts of things like that, which I think is so cool. Definitely worth reading, like I said. Now, part 3 of the Dracula Zone. This book is Dracula by Dacre Stoker and J.D. Barker. Dacre Stoker is Bram Stoker's great-grandnephew, or possibly great-great-grandnephew. I could be wrong about which one. This is a novelization based on the Icelandic translation, as well as Bram Stoker's notes and, like, unpublished manuscripts and stuff like that. And it is a story of, like, Bram Stoker himself is one of the main characters. I won't lie to you, I originally read this book as a joke, because I thought dropping a letter to Dracula to produce a sequel to Dracula was kind of weird. And read it and, like, was enthralled. Loved this. The joke backfired on me very badly. I got to read a wonderful book. So it goes through, like, Bram Stoker as if Dracula was a real story, meeting a vampire, etc., etc. And I will not lie, I'm very gullible, and the epilogue to this, talking about the research put into it and the way that Bram Stoker behaved, did make me question for a second whether or not Bram Stoker was a vampire. So, if you're gullible, be aware that that might happen. I'm not saying he is. I'm just saying if vampires were real, I'm not saying he's not. So, on that note, we are now leaving the Dracula Zone, although personally I am always there in my heart. The next book I don't have a physical copy of. That book is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. We're now going into the different genres of vampire books. So, Salem's Lot by Stephen King came out in 1975. It is a horror book. Stephen King is a horror writer. I don't know if that's clear. Will tell you a secret. When I was a small child, I thought this book was about a haunted parking lot. I did not read it as a small child, in case you were wondering. It's about a man that returns to his hometown where the residents are slowly becoming vampires. It was Stephen King's second novel. And it does really, like, vampires had always been a sort of gothic thing, but it really cemented vampires in the horror genre. to the point that when we created a horror section in our bookstore, I had to argue that not all the vampire stories belonged there, because some of them aren't. For example, the next book we're going to talk about, published 1 year after Salem's Lot, is Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. We currently have sale copies of it, so you can order it right now and only pay $7.98. I have read this book. I have not read any of the sequels to this book. Just prefacing that. These books cement vampires in, like, the romance genre. If you're not familiar with them, it's about the vampire Lestat and Louis, who one of them turns the other into a vampire, and then they, like, live together in Louisiana, and wild things happen. This book is actually pretty good. It's a really good book. It's a classic. If you haven't seen the movie, you should definitely watch the movie. It's fun. But things do get wild later on in the series. At one point, I'm pretty sure the vampires in this book meet Jesus. Literally, at one point, they go to Atlantis. But it also sort of cemented modern day vampires as, like, historical figures, as, like, historical characters. Somebody says, yeah, the sequels kind of killed me after a while, not going to lie. Yeah, I feel like whenever you write a lot of sequels to a book, eventually they go off the rails, but who am I to say? This book, though, is a lot of fun and has, like, a lot of the traditional things I like about vampires in it. So that is Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice, for those just joining us. The next book is very good. I know, because I added it to this pile to talk about at this thing and was so intrigued by it that I started reading it. So it's the book I'm reading right now. That is The Gilda Stories by Jules Gomez. This book was published in 1991. It is a Black lesbian vampire story, which is how it is described in basically everything you find about it online. It's about a young woman who escapes slavery in the 1850s and then gets adopted into a brothel that is run by a vampire. And then, like, continues, eventually, I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm assuming becomes a vampire because she's the main character, and it ends up jumping through time. Like, all of the chapters are titled, like, as a place. So the first one is Louisiana, 1850, and then it's like Rosebud, Missouri, 1921, etc., etc. So it goes through. This book was Jules Gomez was actually discouraged from writing it by a lot of people because she was a part of a lot of, like, different movements, and people thought that it would hurt those movements to talk about, like, a Black lesbian as a vampire when vampires had such negative connotations. But she came up with this book based on a time she was harassed in the street and then got so angry she went home and wrote the first chapter, which I think is very impressive. And it is also, we can't really talk about this book without talking about who we're talking about next, which is Octavia Butler. Jules Gomez, in the introduction to this book, says that she was heavily influenced by Octavia Butler, because Octavia Butler convinced her that there was, like, a place for her in science fiction, which is very cool and very relevant, because the next book we're talking about is Fledgling by Octavia Butler. Now, I will say, I don't have a copy of Fledgling by Octavia Butler because I talked to several booksellers and all of us had read it, but none of us owned a copy. So what I do have is Bloodchild by Octavia Butler, which is not about vampires despite the title. But Octavia Butler is, like, an icon of science fiction. However, despite the fact that the Gilda Stories came out in 1991 and was heavily influenced by her, Fledgling, Octavia Butler's vampire book, didn't come out until 2005, which I think is interesting. Like I said, she's an icon of science fiction, and in such a way, like, takes on the vampire story as more of a science fiction thing than a folklore thing. Usually vampires are much more supernatural based. Her vampires are, like, a separate race that happens to feed on humans and are definitely vampires, but like, are based more biologically than, like, supernaturally. Fledgling is an amazing book. Like I said, an icon of science fiction. You should all read it. I don't currently have it with me, but this one is Bloodchild by Octavia Butler. Next is a book I also don't have with me, but never mind, I skipped one. Ignore me. Next book I do have with me, it is Carpe Jugulum by Terry Pratchett. Now, Catherine, you say, are you going to talk about Discworld in every single one of these videos?
Yes, she is.
If I can, I will. Carpe Jugulum by Terry Pratchett is Terry Pratchett's take on vampires. It's a lot of fun. It's about a bunch of vampires that are invited to a christening. So they are invited into a castle and then they refuse to leave and they try to make everybody bow down to them. It also has a lot of cool things about what happens because of belief and what happens because, like, that's the way things happen. Where some of the vampires think if they just don't believe that the sun will hurt them, the sun won't hurt them, etc., etc. Like all Discworld books, it's a lot of fun. This has some of my favorite Granny Weatherwax moments, so definitely worth reading. And like I have said in past videos and will continue saying every day until I die, all of you should read Discworld. If you don't know which Discworld book to read, because there are 45 of them and you can read any of them to start with, let me know. Tell me things you like, and I will find you the perfect Discworld book, and it will change your life. I promise. This one is Carpe Jugulum by Terry Pratchett. Like I said, if vampires are your thing, maybe this is where to start. I assume vampires are all of your things because you're here with me right now. So, like now, the next book I don't have with me, because, as I mentioned in the last video, I am not currently at my own house. I am at somebody else's house. I am at my partner's house where I am staying until this pandemic is over. So, do not have all of my childhood books, which means I don't have the Twilight series right now. That's right, folks, we're talking about the Twilight series. Like I said earlier, Midnight Sun is coming out in August, so if you want to get back into Twilight, now is the time to do it. Obviously, like, I'm sure all of the books I've talked about so far, but obviously Twilight has its different, like, problems and issues. However, it did really boost the YA genre and kind of, like, made it into its own genre. YA existed before then, but it was less, like, set than it is now. A lot of people say that because Twilight is back, vampires are back. Good news, guys. Vampires never left. Vampires have been here the whole time, you just weren't reading them. There are so many vampires books that have come out since Twilight stopped being super popular, and a lot of them are very fun. I hope there's a lot more vampire books. I love them. And I would have more vampire books to talk about in this Twilight renaissance of vampires. However, like I said, I'm not at my childhood home. So, the next book I'm going to talk about came out, I think, in the Twilight wake. That book is Soulless by Gail Carringer. Soulless is a steampunk paranormal romance with where werewolves and vampires are just, like, a part of society. The main character, however, is unaffected by the supernatural because she does not have a soul. So, I personally love the steampunk aesthetic and, like, Victorian aesthetic and everything, so all of vampire books that take place then are excellent. That was Soulless by Gail Carringer. Now, we're getting into some, modern-day vampire books. These are all adult books, although modern-day YA vampire books do also exist. I just don't have them with me. The first one came out in 2018, then it came out in 2019 in paperback. That is A People's History of the Vampire Uprising by Raymond Villarreal. I love this book. I don't think this book gets enough appreciation in the vampire fandom. If you guys like vampires, what are you doing? Read this book. Vampires have always been representative of, like, not always, I guess, but usually are representative of the rich preying on, like, modern people. That really is shown in this book in, like, a new and fun way. It is the most creative vampire book I have read in recent years. The idea is that vampirism is a disease that starts being spread and the CDC tries to stop it and fails. I know maybe not right now is... I think we just got paused for a second, but we're back now. I know right now maybe isn't the best time to talk about this, but that's like, read it later then. Because after it starts being a disease, people still, like, vampires are the same. They live much longer, they get stronger, they get more beautiful, etc., etc. So rich people start deciding to make themselves vampires, which is how it would go. Let's face it, rich people would want to live as long as possible. So people start willingly becoming vampires, and then they start complaining that, like, businesses are shut down, and they can't go shopping, and they can't go to the mall, and they can't go to amusement parks if they're all shut down at night, and they can't go out in the daytime, which is discrimination against them. Which is, like I said, a little on the nose right now. But an excellent book. It's really great. It's told through, like, a bunch of interviews and documents and found documents and stuff like that. Like I said, the most creative vampire book I've read in recent years, and I've read a lot of vampire books, if that wasn't clear by this whole segment. So that one is A People's History of the Vampire Uprising by Raymond Villarreal. We have it in stock right now. I know because I took this one from the store to talk about it. So the next book came out in 2019. That is NVK by Temple Drake, which is a pen name, but I'm forgetting the author's real name right now. This is described as a gothic page turner. It came with a lot of really cool promotional material, although I'll admit that I haven't actually read the book. I just looked at the promotional material because I was intrigued by the vampires. It's set in, like, a version of Shanghai, but not like the real version of Shanghai, and it's about a man who gets seduced by a vampire. You know, the way these things happen. For the record, I have 2 more books, and then if there's any questions, like, feel free to type them in now and I will answer them, or type them in real quick afterwards, because it's always awkward to, like, sit here and wait for people to ask questions. The next book just came out in April, I believe. I was going to say this month, but this is May now. That's how time works. That is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Grady Hendrix is really cool. He, like, does a lot of, like, really interesting stuff with horror. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires is set in the 1980s. It is about what happens when a Southern book club in, like, a small town, a vampire shows up and, like, integrates himself into the society and starts preying on people. And one of the housewives gets suspicious and decides that she and her book club are going to fight a vampire. Grady Hendrix described this book as he wanted to put Dracula up against his mom and knew that his mom would win. This is an excellent book. Somebody says they are reading it now. Yes, it's so good. I'm so happy for you. It is an amazing book. It's so fun. It, like, really, I don't know. It's such, like, a fun time, even with the horror, because it is a horror book. It does have, like, those sort of, like, ominous, dreadful moments that are then offset by, like, the fun and, like, whimsy of it, which is really interesting. Also, because people can't browse real books right now, with the dust jacket off, it has a little imprint that says it's from the public library of the town of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, where the book takes place, which I think is really cool. I love when, like, actual books do fun things outside of just the hardcover. Like I said, definitely worth reading. I read it and nominated it for the Indie Next list, which I think it was on in April. So I loved it. The last book we're going to talk about is one that we have a sale copy of at work at Trident. But it is just the Penguin Book of Vampire Stories, which I think has a fun cover. And we currently have it on sale. So it's an anthology with a bunch of different gothic vampire stories. So I'm going to run through these real quick. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you love the color. Yeah, it's, like, such an interesting looking book. It's so different from, I feel like, most vampire books. I don't know. I love it. It's a great book. Gonna run through everything. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, it doesn't have to be about vampires, but I'd love to talk about them more. Bunnicula for Best Vampire Book. Liv, you are correct. You know what? You're right. I can't say anything. Bunnicula is so much fun. I give it to all of the children that I know. So, that was Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, NVK, People's History of the Vampire Uprising, Soulless, Twilight, Carpe Jugulum, Bloodchild, but really Fledgling by Octavia Butler. The Gilda Stories, like I said, this is the one I'm reading right now, so if you want to read along with me, you could get a copy, and then you can. Interview with a Vampire, Salem's Lot, Dracula. We did decide when this book came out that you have to say it exactly like that, or it's not the correct title, so if you buy this book, you do have to tell everyone that you're reading Dracula. Powers of Darkness, or the Machtmerkrana, the Icelandic translation of Dracula. Carmilla, and Polidori's The Vampire. So, if there are questions, feel free to type them. I will sit for a minute, but it will get awkward and then I'll feel weird and log off. So, feel free to ask questions, comments, concerns. It doesn't have to be about vampires. It can be about anything. It can be about Trident. It can be about books. It can be just general things about whatever.
How excited are you for Midnight Sun?
So I was just asked how excited I am for Midnight Sun. The answer is very excited. I will be reading that book. And I was also just asked, I need to say if I was Team Edward or Team Jacob. Okay, here's the secret. I was Team Alice because I was gay. So I was like super fascinated by Alice and Rosalie and was like, I just think that we should spend more time talking about them. Bella spends a lot of time talking about Edward, but maybe she should spend more time with Alice, and I didn't have any clue why at the time. And then later I was like, oh, that's what was happening. Alright, if there are no more questions, I'm going to log off. Join me next week at 5 o'clock on Friday to talk about more literature. I don't know what we'll talk about next week yet, but it'll be fun, and I'll have fun with it. So, see you all later. Goodbye!